September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay, 9:04 a.m. A Japanese general picks up a pen. His hand does not shake. His face does not move. He signs his name to a document that ends an empire, and he does it without looking at a single Allied officer in the eye. 11 men in ceremonial uniforms had just crossed the gangway of the USS Missouri. Medals, swords, pressed collars. The posture of men who had decided before they ever set foot on that deck that they would not bow. Not today. Not to these men. Not in front of these cameras. But here is what those 11 men did not expect. Standing 3 feet behind Douglas MacArthur's left shoulder was a ghost. A man they had already broken. A man whose photograph they had printed by the millions and distributed across Asia as proof that the British Empire was finished. That man was still standing. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community, because every story we tell together. His name was Arthur Percival. He was not a famous general. He was not a war hero in any conventional sense. He was a lieutenant general in the British Army, who in February 1942 had walked toward enemy lines carrying a white flag and a Union Jack surrendering 85,000 men to a Japanese force roughly half that size. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. The Japanese called it proof that the British Empire was finished. And now, 3 years and 7 months later, Arthur Percival was standing on the deck of an American battleship in Tokyo Bay, watching the men who had broken him sign their names to surrender. He had not been asked whether he wanted to be there. MacArthur had sent for him personally. The question is why? And the answer to that question is one of the most deliberately constructed acts of historical theater ever performed, a ceremony so precisely engineered that the defeated side had no room left to rewrite what happened afterward. But to understand what MacArthur built on that deck, you first have to understand what happened in a factory building in Singapore on the night of February 15, 1942, and why that single night echoed across 3.5 years of captivity, across the camps of Changi and Manchuria, across a war crimes tribunal in Manila, and all the way back to the deck of the Missouri on the morning it ended. Because this is not a story about defeat. This is a story about what happens to a man after he has been used as a weapon against his own side, and what it means when the war finally answers back. By early 1942, the Pacific War was a catastrophe in motion. Japan had struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and in the weeks that followed, the scale of what was happening became undeniable. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. The Philippines were falling. Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had landed on the northern coast of Malaya in December and were moving south with a speed that Allied commanders had considered impossible, given the terrain. The jungle, which British planners had long regarded as a natural barrier, turned out to be no barrier at all to an army that had trained specifically to move through it. The British strategy for defending Malaya and Singapore had been built on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. The island fortress of Singapore, the cornerstone of British power in Asia, was believed to be impregnable from the sea. The guns pointed south toward the Strait of Malacca. Nobody had seriously planned for an attack from the north through the jungle because the jungle was supposed to be impassable. Yamashita passed through it anyway in 55 days, covering 620 miles using bicycles to maintain the speed of his advance while British and Commonwealth forces fell back ahead of him. By the first week of February 1942, Yamashita's forces had crossed the Johor Strait onto Singapore Island itself. What followed was 7 days that ended an empire's reputation in Asia. Percival commanded the defense. He had approximately 85,000 men, and he was facing an army he did not fully understand, moving in ways his training had not prepared him for, under a commander who had turned the jungle into a weapon. His forces were spread across the island's perimeter. Yamashita, meanwhile, was operating on a secret he had not shared with his own officers. His army was running out of ammunition. His supply lines were stretched across 620 miles of jungle. If the British had held for another week, the Japanese position might have become untenable. Percival did not know this. He knew what he could see. His water supply was failing. His ammunition was running low. His perimeter was collapsing in multiple places, and his men were exhausted. On the morning of February 15th, his senior commanders met and told him what he already understood. The position was no longer defensible. Further resistance would mean mass civilian casualties in a city that could not be evacuated. Percival made the decision that would define him for the rest of his life. He sent a message to Yamashita requesting surrender terms. That afternoon, he walked toward Japanese lines, carrying a white flag and a Union Jack, accompanied by a small group of officers. He was brought to a Ford Motor Company factory building that Japanese forces were using as a forward headquarters. He sat across a table from Yamashita, who reportedly slammed his fist on the table at one point and demanded a simple yes or no. Did the British surrender or not? Percival said yes. Japanese photographers were in the room. The photographs taken in those minutes were developed and distributed within days. Percival appears in them pale, thin, and beaten, a British general at a Japanese table in a building on British colonial territory, signing away 85,000 men. Yamashita had understood immediately what the photographs could accomplish, and he used them with precision. The images moved across Asia in weeks. They appeared in newspapers, on propaganda posters, in government-produced leaflets distributed to civilian populations across Southeast Asia. The message was not subtle. Look. This is what the British Empire looks like when it is finished. This is what its generals look like when they surrender. This is what defeat looks like when it comes for the people who told you they would protect you. For occupied populations across Asia, the photographs did exactly what Yamashita intended. Britain's invincibility, already damaged by Hong Kong, and the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse, had now been visually destroyed. The empire that had spent 3 centuries building a reputation for permanence had been photographed in daylight in defeat. Percival spent the following weeks at Changi Prison on Singapore Island, held inside walls that British engineers had built to house criminals and now housed British officers. There is a particular quality to that kind of captivity, being imprisoned in your own architecture inside a fortress you handed over on an island you failed to defend. Changi was not the worst of what was coming, but it was the beginning of it. As the war expanded and Allied fortunes began slowly to change, the Japanese began moving their senior Allied prisoners. High-value captives, generals, admirals, senior officials were considered intelligence assets and potential leverage. They were also potential liabilities if Allied forces got close enough to liberate them. Percival was moved north eventually to Manchuria, where the camps grew colder, the food grew scarcer, and the uncertainty grew absolute. By the spring and summer of 1945, as American forces pushed toward the Japanese home islands and the possibility of invasion became real, orders were issued to camp commanders regarding senior Allied prisoners. The orders were unambiguous. These men were not to fall into Allied hands alive. Percival did not know with certainty whether those orders applied to him specifically. He knew enough to understand the logic. He lived with that knowledge through months during which the war moved toward its conclusion without him in camps where information was scarce, and the sounds from outside gave no reliable indication of whether the end would come as liberation or as something else. What Percival was during those years is difficult to quantify with historical precision, because he was not the kind of man who described it. What the men who were with him described was a British officer who carried himself in captivity with the same bearing he had carried in command. He did not collapse publicly. He did not blame subordinates. He did not seek special treatment from his captors. When his men were cold, he was cold. When they were hungry, he was hungry. He asked nothing of them that he was not bearing himself. This matters because it complicates the official narrative. The official narrative was Churchill's phrase, "the worst disaster in British military history," and Percival's name attached to that phrase in every account written during and after the war. He was the man who had surrendered. He was the man in the photograph. The question of whether the disaster was caused by Percival's failures or by strategic decisions made far above his rank, the failure to plan for an attack from the north, the failure to send adequate air cover, The failure to reinforce Malaya before Yamashita arrived was never fully litigated in the public record. The photograph simplified everything. You only needed to see the face. But the men in the camps knew what the photograph didn't show. They knew what 3.5 years looked like when you shared them with a man. And what they knew about Percival was not the same thing as what the photograph said. When American forces reached the camp in Manchuria in August 1945 and the gates opened, Percival walked out. He was 58 years old. He had lost over 4 stone. He had spent 3.5 years in a system designed to strip everything from a man, rank, authority, identity, dignity, and reduce him to the bare fact of his worst moment. He was the general who had surrendered. That was what he was inside those walls. He was out of those walls for less than 3 weeks before MacArthur had him on a plane to Tokyo Bay. Douglas MacArthur had been planning the surrender ceremony for months. He understood with a clarity that comes from having studied military history at the level of obsession that the ceremony was not administrative. It was not a formality. It was a statement about reality, and the statement had to be constructed with such completeness that the defeated side would have no structural opening through which to insert a different story afterward. He had watched what happened in Germany after 1918. The German military had spent 2 decades building a mythology around a defeat that it insisted had never really occurred on the battlefield, that the army had been undefeated, that the surrender was a political betrayal, a knife in the back from politicians and civilians, while soldiers stood unbroken at the front. An entire generation of Germans had been raised inside that mythology. The world had paid for it with another world war. MacArthur had no intention of leaving the Japanese military equivalent raw material, so he designed every element of the ceremony with that in mind. The location, the deck of the most powerful warship in Tokyo Bay, surrounded by the largest naval fleet ever assembled in sight of the Japanese coast. The table, the flag, the microphones, the order of signatures, the witnesses above all. Standing directly behind MacArthur as the Japanese delegation approached were 2 men. General Jonathan Wainwright, the American commander who had surrendered Corregidor to Japanese forces in May 1942 and spent over 3 years as a prisoner, and Arthur Percival. The positioning was not symbolic in a vague sense. It was a specific statement addressed specifically to the Japanese officers walking toward that table. The men across from them knew exactly who Wainwright and Percival were. They knew what the camps had been. They knew what those faces had looked like in the photographs at Singapore and Corregidor. They had seen the photographs. Some of them had ordered the photographs, and now those faces were standing 3 feet behind MacArthur looking back. MacArthur had built the ceremony so that the only choice available to the Japanese delegation was how they stood while it happened. And as General Umezu, the man who had voted against surrender at the Imperial Conference, the man who had argued Japan should fight to the last man on the home islands, as Umezu leaned forward over the table and wrote his name without sitting down, without looking at MacArthur, without acknowledging anyone across that table, with every visible muscle of his bearing, communicating that he did not regard himself as a beaten man. None of it changed a single thing about what was happening. You could stand straight. You could keep your face a mask. You could refuse every gesture of submission that military culture offered you. The harbor was still there. The flag was still there. The table was still there. The record being permanently created in those 23 minutes was still there. And Arthur Percival was still there. For 23 minutes, he stood 3 feet behind MacArthur's left shoulder and watched the structural reversal of Singapore. In February 1942, he had sat across a table from Yamashita, in a room Yamashita controlled, signed documents under conditions. Yamashita sat watched by Japanese soldiers, recording every detail for the photographs that would follow. The authority in that room had moved in one direction. Now the authority moved in the other direction. As Umezu's pen crossed the surrender instrument, Percival would have understood with complete clarity what was happening, not as closure, not as revenge, but as answer. The thing that had defined him for 3.5 years was being answered, not erased, answered, by the table, by the documents, by the harbor, by the 23 minutes it took to make all of it permanent. He said nothing that was recorded. He had already said everything that needed to be said. He had said it by being there. But the ceremony on the Missouri was not the end of Arthur Percival's role in the accounting for Singapore, because somewhere in the Philippines, a man was waiting for a trial. The man who had taken the photograph. The man who had understood exactly what to do with it. The man who had made Percival's face into a weapon. Yamashita was alive. He was in custody. He was going to stand trial, and Percival was going to be in that room. In Part 2, we go to Manila. We go inside the War Crimes Tribunal that put the general who broke Singapore on trial for what his soldiers did in the Philippines. And we find out what Percival said when he finally sat across a table from Yamashita, not as a man surrendering, but as a witness. The verdict will surprise you. The aftermath will not. In Part 1, we watched Arthur Percival stand 3 feet behind Douglas MacArthur on the deck of the USS Missouri, watching the men who had broken him sign their names to surrender. We saw how MacArthur had engineered every inch of that ceremony, the table, the flag, the witnesses to make the Japanese military's defeat so structurally complete that no mythology could grow from its bones. And we ended with a name, Yamashita, the general who had taken Singapore, the man who had made Percival's face into a propaganda weapon and distributed it across Asia by the millions. He was alive. He was in custody. He was going to stand trial. But here is what most accounts of that trial leave out. By the time Yamashita sat in that Manila courtroom in October 1945, over 100,000 Filipino civilians had been killed in the battle for Manila alone. The prosecution was not primarily about Singapore, it was about the Philippines. And the legal theory being used to convict Yamashita had never been used in a military tribunal before in the history of modern warfare. If it succeeded, it would change the laws of war permanently. If it failed, every Japanese commander who had ordered or permitted atrocities could walk free on the same argument. And it almost failed. The trial of Tomoyuki Yamashita opened on October 29, 1945 in the ballroom of the Philippine High Commissioner's residence in Manila. The building had bullet holes in its walls. The city outside had been largely destroyed during the February 1945 battle that had killed those 100,000 civilians. The Japanese had murdered them in the final weeks before surrender mass executions, bayoneting of hospital patients, the burning of entire neighborhoods, while the people were still inside. The scale of what had happened in Manila in those final weeks was not disputed. Eyewitnesses filled the courtroom. Survivors testified in detail. The question before the 5-man American Military Commission was not whether the atrocities had occurred. They had. The question was whether Yamashita was legally responsible for them. Yamashita's defense argued that he had not ordered the Manila atrocities. In fact, his lawyers argued he had specifically ordered his forces to withdraw from Manila without fighting, precisely to avoid turning the city into a battlefield. The naval forces that carried out most of the massacres were technically under a separate command structure. Yamashita had been managing a fighting withdrawal against MacArthur's forces in the mountains north of Manila. He had lost communications with his Manila garrison in the chaos of battle. He had not known his lawyers argued what his men were doing in the city. The prosecution's counter-argument was the one that had never been used before. It did not matter. The prosecution said whether Yamashita had ordered the atrocities or even known about them. He was the commanding general. His troops had committed war crimes of extraordinary scale and brutality. A commander is responsible for what his troops do. If he failed to control them, if he failed to prevent the crimes or punish the perpetrators, that failure itself was the crime. Command responsibility. The commander does not get to look away and then claim he was not looking. It was a radical legal theory. Defense counsel, 2 American military lawyers named Frank Reel and Harry Clark, who would later write that they believed Yamashita was being railroaded, argued that the standard was impossible. No commander, they said, could be held criminally responsible for crimes he did not order, did not know about, and could not have prevented, given the chaos of a losing battle against a superior force. To hold Yamashita responsible under these circumstances was to criminalize the fact of command itself. The commission ruled against every significant defense objection. Evidence that would not have been admissible in a civilian court was allowed. The timeline given to defense counsel to prepare was compressed. Defense appeals to the Supreme Court of the United States were rejected, with Justices Murphy and Rutledge writing fierce dissents, arguing that Yamashita was not receiving the legal protections that American law required, even for enemy commanders. Percival testified in late November 1945. He sat in that Manila ballroom and looked across the room at Tomoyuki Yamashita for the first time since the Ford Motor Factory in Singapore in February 1942. What passed between them in that moment is not recorded. Percival was there as a prosecution witness, and his testimony concerned the conduct of Japanese forces in Malaya and Singapore during the 1942 campaign, the treatment of prisoners, the handling of civilians, the conditions in the camps. He was not there to testify about Manila. He was there to establish a pattern. He gave his testimony. He answered questions from both sides. He did not perform emotion for the cameras. He did not deliver speeches. He provided the tribunal with what it had asked him for and left the stand. What he was doing, stripped to its architecture, was exactly what MacArthur had done on the Missouri. He was completing a record, not revenge record. The sequence of events required documentation, and Percival was one of the documents. He had been present at the beginning of the sequence. He would be present at its close. Yamashita was convicted on December 7, 1945, 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor. The date was not an accident. He was sentenced to death by hanging. His lawyers appealed. The case went to the Supreme Court of the Philippines and then to the Supreme Court of the United States. Both courts declined to intervene. Justices Murphy and Rutledge dissented again, with Murphy writing that the trial was a legalized lynching, that Yamashita had been convicted not for what he did, but for what others did while nominally under his command, that the standard being applied would not have been tolerated if applied to an American commander in equivalent circumstances. Those dissents were serious legal arguments. The questions they raised about command responsibility, about where the line falls between a commander's accountability and his actual knowledge and control. Those questions have not been fully resolved in international law even today. The Yamashita Standard, as it became known, has been cited in war crimes tribunals for 80 years. It was cited at Nuremberg. It has been cited in tribunals addressing Bosnia, Rwanda, and beyond. The legal framework built on his conviction has become one of the foundational structures of modern international humanitarian law. Whether Yamashita specifically deserved what happened to him in that Manila courtroom remains genuinely contested among legal scholars. What is not contested is that the framework his trial established made it significantly harder for commanders to hide behind chaos and lost communications when their soldiers were committing atrocities below them. Yamashita was executed on February 23, 1946. He was 60 years old. He died with the composure that Japanese military culture required of him, and the accounts of his execution note that he maintained it completely. He had carried himself throughout the trial without visible distress, answering questions directly, making no dramatic appeals, accepting the Commission's authority without theatrics. In that specific quality, the refusal to perform the maintenance of bearing under impossible circumstances, he and Percival were not entirely unlike each other. The difference was what the bearing was protecting. Yamashita's composure protected a man who had commanded forces that burned civilians alive in Manila. Percival's composure had protected for 3.5 years a man who had surrendered 85,000 soldiers and then carried the weight of that surrender through the camps without breaking his men with it. The photograph that Yamashita had taken at Singapore in February 1942 did not disappear from history when he was executed. It is still reproduced today. It still appears in books about the fall of Singapore, in documentaries about British military disasters, and academic arguments about whether Percival was a poor commander or a man defeated by circumstances far beyond his individual capacity to control. The photograph remains what it was: a document of a specific moment, a face across a table, a signature on a surrender. But the record now contains more than that photograph. It contains the Missouri. It contains Manila. It contains the testimony. It contains the full sequence from the Ford Motor Factory in February 1942 to the execution in February 1946. and the sequence tells a different story than any single image within it. Percival returned to England after Manila. He did not write a memoir designed to rehabilitate himself. He did not seek speaking engagements or media appearances. He accepted a position with the British Legion, the organization that supported veterans and their families, and he spent the remainder of his working years doing that work. The men who had served under him, who had shared the camps with him, gave interviews in the years after the war that described a man nothing like the one in the official histories. They described a man of consistent character, a man who had not saved Singapore but had not abandoned the people inside it either. He died in January 1966 at 78 years old. Churchill's phrase was in every obituary. It will always be in every obituary. The worst disaster in British military history, and Percival's name attached to it permanently, is not a verdict that history has reversed. Singapore fell. 85,000 men surrendered. The photograph exists, but here is what else exists. September 2nd, 1945, and a British officer standing 3 feet behind Douglas MacArthur's left shoulder in Tokyo Bay, watching the authority move back across the table. November 1945, and the same officer sitting in a Manila courtroom, completing the record with testimony, given without drama and without performance. February 1946, and the sequence finally closed. What MacArthur understood and what the ceremony on the Missouri demonstrated with a clarity that required no words is that history is not made of moments. It is made of sequences. A photograph is a moment. A sequence is a truth. The moment in the Ford Motor Factory in February 1942 looked like one thing standing alone. Inside the full sequence, it looks like something else entirely, the beginning of an account that required 3.5 years and 2 separate proceedings before it could be completed. Percival understood this, which is why he said nothing that was recorded on the deck of the Missouri. He was not there to make a statement. He was there because his presence was itself the statement. The man the photograph had been designed to reduce to a symbol of defeat had survived. The camps walked out of Manchuria, stood on the deck of an American battleship, and testified in Manila. The symbol had refused to stay where it was put. He said it by being there. And then he went home and spent the rest of his life working for the men who had been with him. That, in the end, is the story the photograph cannot tell. Not victory, not rehabilitation, not the erasure of Singapore from the record, just the full sequence and what it means when a man stays in it long enough for the record to become complete. In parts 1 and 2, we watched Arthur Percival stand on the deck of the USS Missouri as the instrument of Japan's surrender was signed, then travel to Manila to testify against the man who had broken him at Singapore. We saw how MacArthur engineered a ceremony so structurally complete that the Japanese military had no opening through which to insert a different story. We saw Yamashita convicted and executed under a legal standard that had never been applied before. And we ended with Percival returning to England to quiet work to the men who had served under him. But the story does not end there, because what happened after the Missouri, after Manila, after the executions and the tribunals, and the occupation, is the part that history almost never examines. The question nobody asked in the years immediately following 1945 was the one that mattered most. What did the ceremony actually accomplish? Did it work? Did MacArthur's engineered surrender prevent the mythology that had grown from Germany's 1918 defeat? The answer is more complicated than either MacArthur or his critics wanted to admit. And the numbers are shocking. Within 5 years of the Missouri ceremony, Japan was a functioning democracy with a constitution written largely by American occupation officials. Within 7 years, the occupation ended, and Japan became a sovereign ally. Within 20 years, it was the second largest economy in the world. The speed of that transformation had no historical precedent. It also had a dark underside that the official accounts spent decades avoiding. This is where the story turns. The occupation that MacArthur administered beginning on September 2, 1945, was built on a specific decision that he made in the first weeks after the surrender. He decided not to prosecute the emperor. Hirohito, who had presided over an empire that had killed an estimated 14 to 35 million people across Asia, would not stand trial. He would not be removed. He would remain as a symbolic figurehead, stripped of political power, but present continuous a thread of institutional legitimacy, connecting the old Japan to the new one. MacArthur's reasoning was pragmatic. He believed, and his political advisors supported this belief, that prosecuting Hirohito would produce a resistance movement that would make the occupation ungovernable. The Japanese people's relationship to the emperor was not comparable to a German citizen's relationship to Hitler. It was older, deeper, structurally embedded in the culture at a level that political analysis alone could not fully measure. Remove the emperor, and you remove the institution around which surrender itself had been organized. You risk everything. The decision worked in the narrow sense. The occupation remained largely peaceful. There was no insurgency. Japanese civilians and military veterans complied with occupation directives at a rate that astonished American officials who had prepared for something far more violent. But the decision had a cost, because protecting Hirohito required protecting the narrative around him. If the emperor was not responsible, then the war had been the responsibility of the military clique that had manipulated him. The emperor had been in this version a kind of captive of his own generals, a man who had wanted peace but had been prevented from achieving it by the extremists around him. His speech on August 15, 1945, the recorded message announcing Japan's surrender that most Japanese citizens heard for the first time, as his actual voice was built on this framework. He did not say Japan had been defeated. He said the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He did not say Japan had committed atrocities. He said Japan had always sought peace. The gap between that language and what had actually happened in Nanking and Manila in the camps across the Pacific was enormous. MacArthur allowed that gap to remain because closing it would have cost him the stability he needed to build the new Japan. It was a strategic decision with a strategic logic. It was also a decision that left an accounting permanently incomplete. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, ran from May 1946 to November 1948. 28 Japanese leaders stood trial. 7 were executed, including General Hideki Tojo. The tribunal convicted men who had ordered and supervised atrocities across Asia. It built a record. It established individual criminal responsibility at the highest levels of the Japanese military and government. What it did not do was touch the institution of the emperor. What it did not do was examine the specific role of Unit 731, the biological warfare unit, that had conducted lethal experiments on prisoners in Manchuria, because the American occupation authorities had made a separate deal, immunity from prosecution, in exchange for the research data. The scientist who had killed thousands of prisoners with plague, cholera, and frostbite experiments walked free. Their data went to American military laboratories. That exchange was classified for decades. Percival did not know the details of these decisions as they were being made. He testified at the Manila Tribunal in late 1945. He returned to England. He took up his work with the British Legion. He watched from a distance as the occupation unfolded and the new Japan began to take shape. What he watched in the years after the war was the photograph continuing to circulate. Singapore continued to be examined, debated, relitigated in the historical literature. New accounts appeared that placed the blame differently on Churchill for stripping Malaya of air cover on the War Office, for failing to prepare adequate defenses on the broader strategic failure of British imperial policy in Asia. Percival read some of these accounts. He made occasional public statements that were measured and careful. He never publicly blamed anyone else for what had happened. He accepted the history as it had been written around him, not because he agreed with every word of it, but because reopening the argument would have required him to become something he had decided at some point in the camps or after them that he was not going to become. The question of what Percival actually thought about Singapore, whether he believed he had failed his men or been failed by the system above him, is a question the historical record cannot answer with certainty because he did not leave enough of himself on paper to answer it. The silence is itself a kind of data. Men who believe they have been wrongly blamed tend to say so. Percival largely did not. What he said in the rare interviews he gave was about the men, the prisoners, the veterans, the ones who had come home damaged, and the ones who had not come home at all. He spoke about the need for proper support, proper recognition, proper care. He spoke about the British Legion's work as if it were the only subject that mattered. Whether that was grief or guilt, or simply the temperament of a man who had decided that forward was the only direction worth moving, it is impossible to say from the outside. He died on January 31st, 1966. He had attended a reunion of former Far East prisoners of war. The day before, he died a gathering of the men who had been with him in Changi and Manchuria, the men whose faces he had last seen when the camp gates opened in August 1945. He spent his last full day among them. Then he went home and died in his sleep. The obituaries attached Churchill's phrase to his name, as they always had and always would. But the men at that reunion, the ones who had shared the years with him, gave a different account when journalists asked. They described a man of unbroken bearing, a man who had never asked his people to carry what he was not carrying, a man who had stood on the deck of the Missouri and completed the sequence that began in a Ford Motor factory in Singapore without making a performance of either event. The photograph from Singapore still appears in histories of the Second World War. It will appear as long as Singapore is discussed, which will be as long as the Second World War is discussed. Percival's face across that table, pale and beaten, is one of the definitive images of British military defeat in the 20th century. But the sequence now contains what it always needed to contain. The Missouri, Manila, the testimony, the return home, the last reunion, the full arc from the worst day to the final day, and everything in between that the photograph was never designed to show. MacArthur built a ceremony to prevent mythology from forming around a defeat. He understood that the ceremony alone was not enough, that a single day in Tokyo Bay could not answer 3.5 years of camps and propaganda photographs, and a legal architecture that left significant gaps in its own accounting. What completed the record was not the ceremony, it was the sequence. Every day, Percival continued after Singapore. Every day, he did not collapse, did not flee. The history did not demand that the story be rewritten to make him larger than it had made him. The Japanese officers on the Missouri had refused to bow. MacArthur had built a ceremony that made that refusal structurally irrelevant, and Percival standing behind him was the living evidence that the refusal had always been irrelevant. You could refuse to bow. You could hold your face a mask. You could distribute photographs of your enemy's worst day and call it proof that his empire was finished. The man in the photograph had been standing on a warship in Tokyo Bay. The man who had taken the photograph had been standing in a Manila courtroom answering for what came after. That is the story the photograph cannot tell. Not triumph, not rehabilitation, just the full sequence all the way to the end, and what it means when a man stays in it long enough for the truth to become visible. But there is one more chapter, one that almost nobody knows. What happened to the men who built the legal framework at Manila, the command responsibility standard that convicted Yamashita, and what that framework produced in the 80 years after his execution, is a story that reaches from 1946 all the way to courtrooms that are still operating today. The final chapter of what began on the deck of the Missouri has not yet been written, and in Part 4, we go looking for it. Over 3 parts, we have followed a single thread from a factory building in Singapore on February 15, 1942, to a battleship in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, to a war crimes tribunal in Manila in the autumn of that same year. We watched Arthur Percival surrender 85,000 men, survive 3.5 years of captivity under orders that said he should not survive, stand behind MacArthur as the men who had broken him signed their defeat, and then traveled to Manila to complete the record with testimony delivered without drama. We ended Part 3 with a question about the legal framework built at Manila, the command responsibility standard that convicted Yamashita, and what it produced in the 80 years after his execution. But before we go there is one more question that this story demands. What happened to Arthur Percival after Manila? What happened to the man himself after the sequence was complete? The answer is quieter than the story that preceded it. And in that quiet It contains the final lesson. Percival returned to England in late 1945. He was 58 years old. He had been gone in one form or another since 1941, first to Malaya, then to the camps, then to Tokyo Bay, then to Manila. He came home to a country that was exhausted, damaged, and in the early stages of dismantling the empire, whose defense had cost him everything. The India that Churchill had called the jewel of the empire was moving toward independence. The Southeast Asian territories that British forces had fought and died and surrendered to protect were not coming back in the form they had existed before 1942. The world that Percival had been trained to defend had effectively ended while he was in the camps. He was offered a promotion to full general. He declined it. The rank would have been honorific, a gesture toward rehabilitation, and he understood exactly what it was, and chose not to accept a distinction he had not earned in the field. That decision tells you more about the man than any account written about Singapore. He was not performing humility. He was making a precise assessment of what he had done and what he deserved, and he held to that assessment against the institutional pressure to let the system smooth it over. He accepted a position with the British Legion, the organization that supported veterans and their families, and he worked there for the remainder of his professional life. The work was not glamorous. It was administration advocacy, the grinding daily effort of ensuring that the men who had come home damaged received the support they were owed. He attended reunions. He wrote letters. He sat in offices and made the case repeatedly to government officials and funding committees that the men who had fought in the Far East, the Forgotten Army, as some called them, whose war had been overshadowed in British public memory by the European theater, deserved the same recognition and care as any other veterans. The men who had been with him in the camps did not speak about him the way the official histories did. When journalists found them in the years after the war and asked about Percival, the accounts were consistent. He had been present. He had not separated himself from what his men were experiencing. He had not traded on his rank to secure better conditions for himself while others suffered. He had been in the most literal sense in it with them. One veteran interviewed in the early 1960s said something that stayed in the historical record because the journalist found it precise enough to print without editing. He said, "He never asked us to carry what he wasn't carrying himself. That's all you can ask of a man." That is not the language of a general who had failed his command. It is the language of men describing a particular kind of leadership that is invisible in success and visible only in the worst circumstances. Percival had been in the worst circumstances for 3.5 years, and the men who were there with him had watched how he carried them. He died on January 31, 1966, in Portchester, Hampshire. He was 78 years old. The day before he died, he attended a reunion of former Far East prisoners of war. He spent his last full day in a room with the men who had been with him in Changi and Manchuria, the men whose faces he had last seen when the camp gates opened in August 1945. Then he went home and died in his sleep. Churchill's phrase was in every obituary. It will always be in every obituary. But the legal framework that his testimony helped build in Manila has outlasted every obituary ever written about him, and its reach is a disson that nobody at the Missouri ceremony could have fully anticipated. The Yamashita Standard Command Responsibility. The principle that a commander bears criminal liability for atrocities committed by troops under his authority, even if he did not order them and may not have known about them in real time, became the foundational doctrine of modern international criminal law. It was cited at the Nuremberg trials. It was incorporated into the Geneva Convention's additional protocols of 1977. It formed the legal basis for prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established in 1993, where commanders were convicted for atrocities committed by Bosnian Serb forces in Srebrenica and other locations across the Balkans. It was cited at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994, where military commanders were held responsible for the genocide even in cases where direct orders could not be proven. It forms part of the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court in 1998, which has jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide committed anywhere in the world. The legal standard applied to a Japanese general in a Manila ballroom in 1945 is 80 years later, the operating framework under which military commanders in active conflict zones understand their legal exposure. It has been cited in over 200 international legal proceedings. It has produced convictions in cases ranging from the Balkans to Sierra Leone to the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is taught in every military academy in the democratic world as a core principle of the laws of armed conflict. None of this was inevitable. The Yamashita trial was contested at the time, attacked by serious legal minds, as a violation of basic due process, as a politically motivated proceeding designed to produce a predetermined result, with insufficient regard for the evidentiary standards that the rule of law requires. Justice Murphy's dissent at the Supreme Court that Yamashita had been denied the protections of American law, that the standard being applied would not have been tolerated if reversed, is still cited today by scholars who argue that the foundation of international command responsibility law is built on a flawed original case. They may be right about the specific case. Yamashita may have been convicted on evidence that would not survive scrutiny in a modern tribunal. The question of what he actually knew about the Manila massacres and what he could realistically have done to prevent them, given the operational chaos of a losing campaign, has not been definitively answered by history. But the principle survived the flawed original. The idea that command is not a shield, that wearing the rank of a general does not exempt you from responsibility for what happens beneath you, became law regardless of the imperfect trial that established it. Subsequent application in courts with stronger procedural protections and more rigorous evidentiary standards refined the principle without abandoning it. The doctrine exists today in a form more sophisticated and more defensible than what was applied in Manila in 1945. That is how legal progress often works. An imperfect case establishes a necessary principle. Later cases refine the principle until it can withstand the scrutiny that the original could not. What matters is not that the first application was perfect, but that the principle was established at all, and that it was established clearly enough to survive its own contested origins. Percival testified in that Manila ballroom in service of a principle he could not have fully articulated at the time. He was there as a witness to what Japanese forces had done in Malaya and Singapore, providing evidence in a specific prosecution. He was not a legal theorist. He was not constructing a framework for international humanitarian law. He was an aging general doing what the tribunal asked him to do. But what the tribunal built with his testimony, and the testimony of hundreds of others, became in ways that nobody present in that ballroom could have foreseen one of the most consequential legal developments of the 20th century. The accountability architecture of the modern world for military atrocities runs through Manila, October to December 1945, through the courtroom where Percival sat across from Yamashita and gave his account. Here is the detail that almost nobody knows, the one that closes the circle, in a way that the official histories have never quite found the language to describe. When the British Legion published its history of the organization's post-war work in the 1970s, a chapter was dedicated to the advocacy efforts on behalf of Far East prisoners of war. The men who had been held in the worst conditions, whose suffering had been systematically underdocumented, because the Pacific Theater received less public attention than Europe, and who were receiving less compensation and recognition than their counterparts who had served in the European campaign. The chapter noted that the single most effective advocate for these men within the Legion structure, the official who had pressed hardest and most consistently for equal recognition and financial support, was Arthur Percival. The man the photograph had reduced to a symbol of defeat had spent 20 years fighting through bureaucratic channels and committee meetings and letters to ministers to ensure that the men he had surrendered with received the same treatment as every other veteran. He won. The government revised the compensation framework for Far East prisoners of war in the 1950s, extending benefits that had previously been denied or reduced on technical grounds. Thousands of men received support they had been owed for years. Percival filed no personal claim. He applied for nothing for himself. The photograph from Singapore is still reproduced today. It will be reproduced as long as the Second World War is studied, which is to say, permanently. Percival's face across that table, pale and thin and beaten, is part of the historical record of the 20th century, and it will remain so. But the record now contains the full sequence: the Missouri, Manila, 20 years of quiet advocacy for the men who had been with him. A legal framework that now governs how the world holds military commanders accountable for what their soldiers do. From a British officer carrying a white flag toward Japanese lines in February 1942, to a witness in a Manila courtroom in November 1945, to a bureaucratic advocate who spent 2 decades ensuring his men were not forgotten. Arthur Percival demonstrated that the measure of a person is not the worst photograph ever taken of them, but what they do with every day that comes after it. The men in the camps with him knew this. It took history somewhat longer to catch up. But history, given enough time and a complete enough sequence, usually does.